Well, I want to, again, thank you, Murli, for being here and sharing your insight. I mean, I think part of why we're all here is, on both the, Snorkel / cloud partner / vendor side and the enterprise AI side, now is the time to deliver, right? We've had the kind of innovation lab chatbot, and now we all have to move to real business value, real deployment, real impact, right? So I think that's I think the framing that I think overall is most important here. But maybe to start it off, as someone who's actually leading a bunch of these efforts and driving that impact, you've talked about this quite a bit, but can you share a little bit more about how you think about, driving, delivering, and measuring impact of AI on actual enterprise objectives?
Certainly. Going back to your introductory remarks a couple of moments ago to our conversation, Alex, it reminds me of a conversation that I was having in a different context. But the question that we were grappling with is, could the next 10 years in our lives coming up as of today be consequential to the next 1,000 years of humanity is a question that we were toying with. I think that's certainly from my perspective quite a bit of an exaggeration, but just that thesis of we're at this sort of precipice, at this very interesting point in our advancement where the choices we make over the next decade could be consequential for generations to come is a very powerful and humbling concept. But coming back to your question, in the context of a large organization, the opportunity that I see, Alex, is too often the conversation tends to veer toward the concrete set of choices that we need to make, which are important to make around which partners and which LLM or SLM and things of that nature. All of those are important questions to ask. I think the bigger opportunity, especially given where we're headed, is this notion of how do you think about the augmentation of machine intelligence through human intelligence, which means that you have to step back, in my view, from thinking about the tools and trying to search for solutions. Rather, you have to be able to reimagine how you'd like your firm to be able to operate 12, 18, 24 months from now in some very important aspect of its operations, and then say, how could advanced analytics or AI or generative AI, you use sort of any moniker that you like, be in service of that? And then also recognize that when you think about that problem, it isn't just a one-off solution. You're actually re-architecting an entire system because you're affecting what people do and how they go about their jobs. So you're affecting their sense of identity. And so taking a much more systems approach to identifying problems, to me, is step number one. Everything else follows. And I have a framework around how I think about it, which I'm happy to share at some point.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe at some point is next. I'd love to hear that. But I just briefly remark, I mean, first of all, I'm sorry to drag us right into the pragmatic weeds of enterprise before talking about that, humbling context that you mentioned. I just agree, right? It's kind of interesting in that, you have to, I think personally, a lot about trying to find this middle ground between, if you're too just staring down on one, the step in front of you, then you're missing the bigger picture. You're missing the opportunity to think about systems versus just modular replacement of components. Yeah. If you look too far ahead and you get too absorbed in the hype, then you're only thinking, 1,000 years ahead, and you're not doing what we all need to do right now, which is show that real value can be delivered 100%. In a safe, compliant, practical way. So it's like, what's that middle ground between kind of doing the big picture thinking, but also being, delivering pragmatic results, right? And that's just kind of reflected on that when hearing your remarks.
I mean, I think Alex, we as human beings are wired to do that. Think about it. When we're actually driving, we're making that constant adjustment of seeing what's a quarter of a mile ahead, and we're also looking at what's 20 feet in front of us. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's really being able to understand the connection between the choices that you make here and now, and what is that in service of? Because the choices that you make in the here and now aren't actually isolated. They actually shape what comes next and the thing after that. And how do you have that ability to think reasonably ahead in the future. And by reasonable, I don't mean 1,000 years. In the long run, we're all dead multiple times over if you're a Hindu. But at least, in the next, say, 6, 18, 12 months. And then to be able to fold that back and say, how do I architect that reality based on the tool set that I have access to in the here and now?
Yeah, I think it's both a great perspective. It's also a very, all that like that long-term planning is exactly what we're currently trying to, technically get LLMs to do better at. So it's great to know that this is something that also right now, it's still up to us humans to do. I think the other part that you talked about doing kind of full systems thinking, just to plus one that, right? I think, a lot of the early waves of AI, and kind of pick your area. If I think even 5-ish years ago, when deep learning was starting to take off, but maybe pre-transformer, the current kind of step change we've gotten to, you'd see a lot of domains where there'd be a big system and people were kind of doing, AI or ML or deep learning for X component.
Yes.
Like pick your area, databases, right? It's like no one was re-architecting the overall database system. It was just, we can do a better, query optimizer, or better, index retrieval or something like that. And think about that with an organization. We can just replace this thing. I think you're right that we are getting capability-wise, toolkit-wise into the, we're on the doorstep of being able to think of that whole system engineering.
Indeed.
And the interesting thing there is it's like, local versus global optimization. Sometimes by re-architecting the system, you can actually make the problem easier than if you were just trying to, automate one little process. So I think we're still early innings there, but I love that call to action there.
And I think, Alex, that sort of systems thinking, it's a little bit, the analogy, I always try to think in terms of analogies.
Yeah.
It's like if you're solving for a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, you can't hang your hat on a single piece. Mm-hmm. So you have to have that ability to be able to see the total picture, and then you've got to be able to play with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces, in my view. But I think the reason we tend to hang our hats on the concrete choices that we make or on which large language model to use and which tools and such is that this other bit about being able to reimagine the future and to have that curiosity without focusing on the toolkit is actually very tough to do. Yep. And yet, in my view, as we continue to progress down this sort of AI journey, this ability to be able to think in the abstract and connect the concrete tools to achieve that abstract is mission critical. That, to me, is the role of what human intelligence needs to be starting now. And that, from my vantage point, is a little bit of a deficit area. And so in the absence of that, because we don't really kind of think about it as a system, we have a harder time thinking about how are we going to architect that end-to-end change. And I've been in many forums where you've got people in this space of analytics, machine learning, AI, whatever we want to call it. And the question on the table is, well, how do we prove our worth? Or how do we quantify our impact? And if you sort of step back, it's almost a naive question to ask, because you're in the data space and you're asking the question, how do I quantify the value of what I deliver? And the reason for that is, in my view, that we're not naturally designed to be systems thinkers. We're naturally designed to be experts that can be a bit too deep and narrow at the expense of being systems thinkers.
Interesting. So that's a segue. Well, actually, I don't want to let the other, you offered to share the framework. I want to jump back to that. Or I do also want to ask, okay, let's jump back to that first. You had said there was a framework that you could share. I'd love to dive into that now if you're open to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you think about many institutions, they do thousands and thousands of things. And the problem statement is, how do you know where to get started? We kind of know, well, not kind of, we pretty well know the power of generative AI, right? Extraction, summarization, conversational intelligence, and such. And the question is, in what context do you apply it? Yeah. And the framework that I've used with my team across Citi is to say, is a particular process highly manual and repetitive? Is it prone to errors? And when you have errors, are they financial consequences or customer experience consequences, or being in banking, regulatory consequences? Yeah. Do you have a material out-of-pocket costs associated with it? And do you have some form of data exhaust? Obviously, sort of in the loosest sense, possible, the definition of data. And if you think through that, and then you, in a relatively systematic way, figure out what do hundreds and thousands of people do, thousands and thousands of people do that is error-prone, that is expensive, that's based on partial sampling. When we make mistakes, it's consequential. And say, how could that be re-architected through a more semi-automated way, where the role of the human being isn't to be doing manual repetitive things, rather it is to be able to apply that higher order of intelligence that frankly machines cannot, because essentially whatever moniker we give it, machines and data are a manifestation of the past. There's no creation happening there. And I have this sort of belief that the world's going to belong to people who can create new forms of data, not necessarily people who are analyzing historic forms of data.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most hotly contested areas of, is there true creativity and out-of-sample generalization happening with these models, or is it just, interpolation across the internet? And I won't drag us deeper into that rabbit hole right now, but I certainly think that is where there's the biggest gap for contribution, is creativity, novelty. Agreed there. I mean, this is a little bit in the weeds, but just to go into your framework, which I think is a great one. Well, actually, let me take a step back, and I think that this ability to triage, one theme that I both see and hear across all the enterprises that we get to work with and get to observe how they're working with and preparing to use Gen AI, is this criticality of the framework, the triage framework, right? One commonality we're seeing, which is both, I think, for us AI practitioners, whether you're on the vendor side supporting or you're actually owning the mandate internally at an enterprise, from my perspective, it seems both thrilling and terrifying, is that there just is this flood of line of business interest. And the framework to triage and say which of this is, so trivial that you should be able to do it yourself, which of it is so ambitious or just poorly formed that we don't even know how to define success, we don't want to touch it. Which of this should we jump on as a central AI team? Which of it, should we urge caution? Because that triage framework is so critical to Gen AI success, because it doesn't matter if and I'd love to hear any edits you have to this perspective, because I'm, again, looking in from the outside, kind of broad and shallow, but it doesn't matter if you have 1,000, potential line of business projects. If you don't pick the right ones to win, then it's meaningless.
100%, 100%. So, it's a little bit like saying, the cost of a loaf of bread in Zimbabwe is 1,000. Well, what does that even mean? There's no real anchoring around that. So I think that the more systematized way to think about it is have a framework in which you identify opportunities, number one. Number two, have a sense of what are your anchor measures of success. They may or may not be financial, but there has to be some quantification of what will be better as a consequence of achieving a certain desired outcome, and how would you measure that in a tangible way, whether that's financial or not. And then the third is, how do you prioritize? So the way I think about it is we essentially think about three dimensions: time, value, and risk. And why we like that framework is it becomes a little bit of a forcing mechanism to say, where on those three dimensions would I put a particular problem or opportunity statement? And as I look at my portfolio, how am I divvied up across those three dimensions? And do I feel like I have a quote-unquote balanced portfolio? And I think that's particularly valuable at the onset, where your goal is to prove the power of this capability, have material outcomes that the CEO and a CFO can point to, and then lay the groundwork for sort of the mass AI intelligence of your workforce. To me, that objective of the mass intelligence of the AI workforce should actually follow the marquee set of successes versus the other way around, because the risk is, if it's the other way around, then it just becomes a little bit of a smorgasbord where you're just throwing spaghetti on the wall and hoping that something sticks. It's not a strategy. It's a hope that somehow magic will happen somewhere And I'm not saying that isn't valuable. I think that's valuable ultimately. I'm not sure that that's where I'd start, because if you start there, then you have the risk of trivializing the power of this and not achieving big ticket success items that can fund your ongoing investment. So there's a highly pragmatic view to this that I think most firms should consider reflecting upon.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I like that idea of the balanced portfolio. And look, I think people are generally in agreement that there's not an infinite time horizon to prove value. A, so you have to kind of pick your shots, right? And then B, that idea of, getting marquee wins. I think that's both to get that proof across the line and to be intentional and smart about it versus just, as you said, throwing it against the wall. Also to set up templates for people, right? I will say, like, one thing that I talked to this briefly in the morning, but I think we are seeing that there are different categories too. Like there's, however you draw the distinction, I was using the terminology wave one, wave two, but there's some use cases where I think, we do have some templates where we kind of, I think as a community feel like we can kind of release this for mass usage and it's going to be mildly successful and it's low risk. Like, Code Copilot or Search are two examples where, they're very human in the loop. They're over very,
it's almost foundational enabler.
Yeah, foundational enabler, and people are used to it. People know that people don't, go rest critical business decisions on the first search result being correct. They know that they're going to have to kind of filter through, and they're used to that, right? Code Copilot, as long as it's better than Stack Overflow or some lookup, it doesn't have to be perfect. There's a human. So we have some use cases, and you can see the the business run rates that result from the companies supporting them. But then, the area where many of us, Snorkel and I think a lot of your work included is, okay, what about the higher impact stuff? The stuff 100%. That can actually automate, that can transform the whole system, that can deliver real needle moving value. And that's not only it's the bigger win potential, but it's also riskier, right? Because, by dint of it being higher value, right? So there, I like your strategy of you got to be really intentional about the balanced portfolio. You got to pick your shots. And I think the other thing you said in the previous part, just I want to also highlight and kind of plus one from my perspective at least is you were talking about kind of what's the baseline of how often humans make mistakes. Yeah, I think a lot of this is relative to baselines. Like, if I tell you, hey, this AI model, it's likely going to be 80% accurate, it's kind of meaningless unless you know. Well, if humans are at 99%, well, that's pretty abysmal. If humans are at 40%. And the mistakes are costed, that's pretty amazing. Absolutely. Right? So that idea of doing that calibration initially on that, I think it sounds so maybe obvious, but it's so, I think, undervalued in how people think of it.
In my experience, Alex, I think we hold machines to an infinitely higher standard than human beings. How many of us have read articles of the Tesla autopilot running over a pedestrian in Phoenix? I think it was a couple of years ago. And would you like to be able to read about every single time a human actually ran over a pedestrian and unfortunately killed him? It's just sort of that baseline probability is fundamentally different, would be my guess. And I don't think that we have the same charitable mindset toward machines that we do toward human beings.
Yeah, I agree. And a nerdier double click on that for a second is just, there's this notion of an inter-annotator agreement rate. And it's often interesting that we, I don't know why I said nerdier. I mean, self-driving also, we're all in the same umbrella here. But this concept is interesting for calibration because sometimes you have teams where they're saying, okay, well, we need to hit 99% or else we can't ship this to production. And we say, okay, go measure how often your subject matter experts agree, and it's maybe 70%.
Indeed.
And above 70% is just kind of arbitrary or noise, and so it's interesting. People default to holding to such a high standard, and you actually have to kind of gather data to convince them sometimes. Oh, actually, that's a higher standard than we're even implicitly holding our own people to, right? But anyway, so I think like if I jump back up, like we're talking about a lot about this human element, right? And you've talked about this before, both some of our chats and just in some of your other talks. Like, would love to hear your thought about kind of where does the human fit in when we start re-architecting the system? Just big picture.
I love this. You know, I couldn't tell you how much energy I have for this because I think about it every single day. And the reason I think about every single day is I've spent a lot of time reading the book Mental Models by Shane Parrish. And one of the things he talks about is the role of ethos, pathos, and logos in how we process information and how we draw opinions. And logos or logic or data is last on that list. And I think it's because we're not naturally wired to be nearly as objective as we think we would. And so when we think about these systems changes that we would like to make, in my mind, this notion of no, everybody will be fully employed is, it makes zero sense to me. However, the other end of the bookend of, oh gosh, machines are going to just sort of consume everything and humans will become useless is also ridiculously trivializing the intelligence that we're all capable of. So I think that the questions that we ask of the machine and the information that we get from it and how we frame it and how we end up doing higher order work becomes our superpower. But I don't think that everybody will be able to consistently make that adjustment to be able to be effective in that new world. So I think that there will be some turbulence ahead in terms of people's ability and willingness. I was listening to a talk by an economist who talked about the move from, the Stone Age to agrarian age, and then the move from the agrarian age to the industrial age. And then this is me sort of inserting a thought here, the move from the industrial to the information age. And now we're making the leap, in my view, from information age to intelligence age. And in my view, the skill sets that it took in each of those moves might not have been as profoundly different. With a lot of, I'm sure, sort of stress in the system, people develop the skills eventually. But now, that expectation, that chasm is probably wider than what we've ever seen before across the history of humankind, in my view. And so I think that's going to cause some serious trepidation, but there's no shying away from the fact that the repetitive, menial, sort of, dare I say, unintelligent aspects of our routines should not belong to us and will not belong to us. What we do with that extra time and how we build relevance is the big question, and maybe that means that we're going to end up working fewer hours, but the quality of that work needs to be ratcheted up quite a bit, and so there's less busy time and more time for us to bring out the best in us. But that's going to be, in my view, and I'm sorry, I'm answering a question in a macro way.
No,
I wasn't
it's
sure
awesome.
if you wanted me to answer it in a micro way as well.
We're at the, at least in how I think about the arc of a day like this. We're at, I think, the bigger picture part. So definitely happy to go into like the weeds, but the bigger picture thinking is pretty fun and exciting. And I think, I mean, there's so many thoughts there, and I won't ramble on, but I think, first of all, there's obviously lots of benefits. There's a lot of optimism, I think, behind all of us in AI, and I think there's this notion that I think we had brought up, or you had brought up a bit earlier of democratization of intelligence, and I want to pick on that in a second. I do think it would be irresponsible and unempathetic to say there's no likelihood of any turbulence ahead, right? I mean, we could say that, and maybe it would sound better, but then we're not planning for anything in an empathetic way. And so I think from a governmental, from a societal perspective, understand that any transition of this magnitude, there's going to be some turbulence. Planning for that in an empathetic way is critical. Also remembering that like a lot of things we take for granted, are more malleable than we think. I mean, the notion of like every single person has a job that they, define their identity, like that work is so tied to your identity as it is in our culture today is not that has not been constant across history, right? Yeah. So is it less work but higher quality? Is it more work that is closer to art, or things that we don't, again, there's so many different configurations that can follow. It could be different types of work. It could be different types of ways of spending our time that we find existentially valid. But I think you're right that there are going to be big shifts. But on the positive side, just to drag us there a little bit, or that could all be positive, but on the...
It's both, like most things in life. It's both, there's some trepidation in that perspective, but there's also some optimism.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we as individuals in a collective sort of work through that?
But no, I agree. And I love that phrasing, right? So, but in the like unambiguously positive part of things, or I think at least, like this notion of democratization of intelligence, what does that phrase mean to you? How do you think of articulating that?
I love that concept. And the reason I love that concept is that up until now, we've used the phrase democratization of data. And for me, data unto itself is kind of, don't get offended by this a little bit, meaningless, because it's what you do with it that matters. And what does data represent? Data represents...
By the way, I love that, because if data was perfectly labeled and meaningful and organized, we might be out of a job.
There you go. There you go. So you are our pathway to intelligence and democratization.
I'll take it.
How's that?
Someone write that down for our new brochures.
So I think this notion of democratization of data is totally passé, because data unto itself is meaningless unless it drives intelligence. And that intelligence drives decisions, and those decisions drive positive outcomes. That's sort of how I think about that journey. And I fundamentally believe that we're moving away rapidly from a world of I have questions and I want to search the data, to a world of I want the data to speak to me. I want to have the data converse with me on things that it is seeing that I might not have a hypothesis for that is worthy of my attention. I'll give you an example. I know this whole conversation has been a little bit in the abstract, so I'll at least give one real-world example. A couple of years ago, the banking industry suffered an inordinate amount of losses from Zelle fraud issues. And it took the industry more or less, and I say the industry in a broad swath sense, the better part of 2 months to detect the problem. And the issue was that if we had had the system that could actually take in all of our interaction and transaction data, it would have detected abnormality within a matter of days. How? In essence, it would be able to say, look, we're ingesting the system, the AI brain is ingesting the call data, and the call data is showing a spike in customer complaints related to legitimate Zelle transactions getting declined. And it's not such a big volume that it would shift the entire sort of water level of the complaints, but it would be significant enough where you'd sort of start seeing that trend in day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and you'd know that something was fundamentally amiss with that particular area. The reality is that as human beings, we are utterly incapable of having that as a hypothesis, as much as we're incapable of having 1,000 other things that could go wrong that we only know about in retrospect and then try to force fit that in the future going forward. So I think the beauty of the AI systems that we're generating in the here and now is that this notion of intelligence at your fingertips is going to become very, very, very powerful, because you will not lack for information and intelligence, and you will be measured and you will be successful predicated upon your ability to take that information and intelligence and translate that into more thoughtful questions and more thoughtful decisions and more powerful outcomes. That to me is magical, because you're no longer searching. Searching is done for you. It's how you think about the insights from the searching that allows you to elevate the intellect that you lean into your roles, regardless of whether you're a CIA analyst or whether you're a data analyst in a bank or in a healthcare company or what have you.
I love that notion. I think it goes with, some of the cheesy metaphors we and others use around data of data being oil. I think data is kind of like crude oil, and if you can refine it, then you can do something with it. It doesn't magically give you the answer to life, but it gives you something that you can actually operate with.
And sorry, my aspiration is that we make data more like solar energy, because it's regenerative and it can actually create intelligence and insights and power on an ongoing basis.
I like that. I should pick I got to work out a metaphor that's more in line with my actual views on sustainable energy choices, which are very much aligned with that one. I'm gonna take a leaf out of that book. Yeah, I mean that distinction of usable and unusable. I mean that's been a big motivation for many of us. And I think it's been one of the biggest step changes is the ability to use unstructured data. Like I think about one example from my personal life. My wife is an oncologist and she works in a research hospital and is a researcher. So like. She will cite all these studies, and I am, I'm like very biased, obviously, and in awe of it. But then, the flip side that we both think about is, well, what about an overworked doctor in a lower resource hospital system? How do we get that across the board? And you could say, well, all the information's there. Everything is in the public scientific literature, but most people don't have the time,
or the ability to sort of be able to sift through that.
Yeah, and so how do you democratize that? How do you democratize not just, oh, look, we have data that we can access, but actually we have data that has insights we can pull from it and use. I think it's such a powerful point. Maybe, I think we're at time, so maybe, I want to give Murli the last word. So maybe if you have it, I want to keep this inspirational, but also grounded in what folks hear. If you have advice on kind of how to take kind of the first step with AI and to get real value out of it and on that pathway to the kind of aspirations we've been talking about here,
I thought you were going to ask me for my favorite quote, which was certainly not going to be very grounded, but I'll throw that in anyway.
Well, let's do that too. You're right. I should let you. You can pick your ordering. I
there you go. No,
one softball, a favorite quote, and then one non-softball.
The non-softball is set aside the tools. Recognize that the power of LLMs is essentially contextualization, summarization, extraction, conversational intelligence, and ask yourself, where are the problem areas? Problem areas either where mistakes are made, customer pain points, where there's sort of data exhaust, whether that's a call transcript or image or videos and things of that nature that tie to friction points. Depending on your industry, that could be regulatory or it could be customer experience. And where there's material cost that is going out the door in a way that, in your assessment, is unproductive. Lean into that and forget about the tools and ask yourself, how could you re-architect that space end to end, and how would you measure success? And so have a relatively structured way in which you do your search, have a thoughtful way in which you prioritize, and please, please, please hold your feet to the fire to be able to have a very clear view on what success looks like, even if the answer is in a range, how you would measure that, how could you touch, see, smell, hear that, and make sure that those metrics are material, and make sure that you understand when you have those measures, how they tie to the ecosystem, because invariably, with any one of those things that you want to tackle, people's jobs and their sense of identity is at stake. And so you have to apply that sort of holistic view and not just think about it in just a narrow context of a technical solution.
Yeah. What does success look like for the ecosystem, for the team, for the company, not just for some narrow objective? I love that 100%. Point. The systems thinking, again, coming back to that as a theme. That was I think I gave you a softball accidentally because that was supposed to be the hard ball, and then it was just like that.
I made it a softball. What can I say?
Well,
I was going to give that answer no matter what he asked.
Was that also your favorite quote?
No. My favorite quote. I'm going to leave you with this.
I'll give you that one as the last one.
I think about this every single day, at least for the next 3 weeks. And I think when we go down this path, we're going to be challenged. We're going to have conflicting ideas and thoughts and views. And I would urge you to think about the quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is that true intelligence is the ability to hold competing ideas in your mind at the same time and yet function effectively. I think being able to challenge ourselves, to be able to see the other point of view of coworkers who might be intimidated by some of these changes, and obviously this thought can apply to many facets of our lives. I just urge us to be thinking about that, because I think having that human lens can help us be more effective in being architects of change versus deliverers of technical insights.
I love that. Murli, thank you so much. Let's all thank Murli for such an insightful panel. Thank you so much.
Keep the round of applause going, everybody.
Wonderful to hang out with you.
We're going to open it up really quick for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if someone has a question, we've got microphones floating around.
I can just give my answer.
Just give your answer. Oh, we've got a question in the back right there.
Anyone can ask about any favorite quote. And nothing else. No, I'm kidding.
Hi, Chris Glaze. I'm a researcher at Snorkel. Thank you for that. It's really informative and insightful. So thinking about things from a systems perspective and the role of humans, can we consider humans as being a part of that system? If users are part of the system, and my big question to you is when you're scoping out use cases and thinking about architecting things in the abstract, how much are you partnering with like product developers and thinking about UX and what the final outcome is actually going to look like from a user's perspective? Because this is no longer just about analytics and AI, but about a system and how it's being consumed and impacting business processes. I'm just curious if you could talk about that process and how you're partnering with product developers, if at all, in that initial stage.
Absolutely.
Murli, I think our UX team planted that and laundered it through our research team.
I love design thinking. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're trying to sort of influence this system as a whole, you've got to be able to sort of work your way toward the end state and then backward to what you need to do in the here and now. And that end state is a certain set of people, their roles will be different. Perhaps how they consume knowledge and how they make decisions, their workflows will be different. The tools that they have access to will be different. And so being able to start from that and work your way backward allows us to make sure that we're perfectly clear on what the objective is. And when we do that, being inclusive in that with having functional partners that can represent those complementary views around how they would like for that to be able to pan out, I think is very important. So again, for me, it always goes back to, can you imagine what success looks like, say 12 months or 6 months from now? Why that matters and how would you measure it? And then how do you work your way back? And part of that success is this thing of this concept of your solution taking root in a way that is sustainable. You cannot do that if you don't have an appropriate amount of, at a minimum, sympathy, ideally empathy for the end users.
Thanks. Fantastic. We've got another question right over here, our final question.
Alex, everything that both of you guys talked about, I loved it. Question for you, Alex. In the horizon of tech space as the technology is moving, and quantum computing is not that far out, it's right on the horizon. I would love to hear your thoughts as to how you see that impacting the structured versus unstructured data, and then bringing it down to LLMs, and then bringing it down to, Murli, what you mentioned about, think about what the success looks like and start structuring it from that far horizon back into where you stand today and build your KPIs. But would start with your thought about impact of quantum computing back into structured, unstructured data into LLMs.
I'm glad I got the softballs.
Yeah, so some cosmic karma there. I thought I was, I didn't even know I was answering questions. I went straight from thinking that I was just sitting here interviewing to quantum computing. That was a fast turnaround of fate. I think the magicians are maybe pretty busy back there. I don't know, we might want to get going there. Okay, I'll take a stab. It's an awesome question. I'm just joking around. I mean, I honestly, I actually literally was talking to someone earlier today about how we were both physics undergrads, and I literally said the phrase that I live in fear that someone will ask me about physics, and that I will admit how little I remember from, my late nights at physics problem sets. In terms of, so I'll say this at a high level, like in terms of, my ability to prognosticate on like timelines and details of quantum computing, I'm 2 heads deep in data and Snorkel and 3 kids under 4 to actually, have enough to say there, right? I do think in terms of, let me talk in terms of overall, step changes in ability to just, step changes in compute scale. I think that's obviously like if you abstract away from the details, which again, I'm not qualified at this moment to say anything that, you wouldn't be able to more capably read online, and talk about kind of how would step changes in compute scale impact using use of LLMs, and then use of LLMs to go from unstructured to structured data, which I believe was the general question. I'll point to a couple of high-level things, right? One, I think a lot of the focus is on if we unlock either bigger computers or the new chip or quantum computing, how will that impact our ability to train these models, both kind of pre-training and post-training, right? You might be able to guess what I'm about to say, but our viewpoint, like many, I think now, is that the primary bottleneck is really rapidly becoming data and data quality, where data quality itself is so subjective to what do you actually care about, more so than is compute. So, we see a lot of narratives. And I'm saying that to be a little bit interesting and provocative and on message, because you still see, even in the news recently, it's like, some of our wonderful partners are like literally buying nuclear reactors and making power plant commitments to back these step changes in compute. Like that is a massive investment into basically behind the opinion that we need more compute. I'm not saying we don't need more compute, and quantum computing advances would obviously be a game changer there. But we see also a lot of evidence that the quality of the data and the quality of the human feedback in that data, and also the specificity of that data, tie back to some of Murli's points. I'm going to try to drag you into this question. Like the specificity of the data relative to what we actually care about doing is so important that I think we often get distracted by the let's buy a nuclear reactor. What if quantum computing steps up compute? We could have infinite compute, but if you can't define what your objective is and therefore what data you need and what you actually need to teach the model, just like we could send someone to college for, imagine you could send a human to college for infinite years. Wouldn't still help them become an expert at solving, say, a key problem in Murli's org or in one of your orgs, right? So yes, compute needs to go up. Yes, quantum computing and/or nuclear reactors could be a step change to that. But I think there's so much around just defining, using the systems thinking, marrying that with business objectives, defining what do we actually care about, and therefore what data and human insight do we need before we just throw compute at the problem. I will say the other part of the answer is after training. So with models like O1, and actually, shameless plug for some of our research collaborators, one of our co-founders, Chris Ray, and team published a paper about 2 months ago, so before O1, just talking about the ability to just run more inference, basically give the LLM more guesses, and then if you can kind of select from there or search across them, you can get so much better performance. So we're seeing this big, this big kind of this kind of flip of a switch over from just training to search at inference time, kind of like AlphaGo. But that's what you're seeing with O1 and models that are going to follow very rapidly open source and closed source like it. And there also, compute will take us, far, in that you can have now the model do more kind of thinking and reasoning and searching when you ask the question faster, where again, quantum compute, but any compute changes will be step changes. But also, again, a lot of it is the data to teach it how to do that search, teach it how to do that inference, right? Just purely running LLMs for longer at inference time, giving them more time to think, it does something pretty impressive. But the secret behind to the best approximation of what I know, behind O1 and that kind of model was not just they run it for longer, it's that they taught it how to think and reason better through training data. So again, in summary, I'm admitting I don't know a lot about the latest in quantum computing, but in terms of what can step changes in compute capacity unlock, I think it's obviously pre-training, post-training, and now inference time, search, and reasoning, as we've seen. But all of that is more bottlenecked on what do you actually want to do, how do you get the data to teach the model to do it, than it is purely on compute, and I think people critically underestimate that. Okay, that was my best attempt at answering a quantum computing question.
It's fabulous.
Big round of applause for Alex and Murli.
Murli, thank you again so much.